Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. And stop. Before we get started into this video, I want to put out a disclaimer about the content of this video. Now, we talk about a lot of things in history, and a lot of things in history are not pleasant. You know, we just got over, we were just talking about the Civil War and slavery, and, you know, it's a terrible, terrible stain on our country's history. But at this time, in order to give you the full picture of the country and the state that it was in at this time, I have to teach you about something that is another very unpleasant thing, and I wanted to give everybody a warning before we go into this. This video is going to discuss and touch on the beginnings of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I know that this is a very, it's a terrible topic. You know, it is, this is a terrorist group, and this is something that is bizarrely still around today. This group still exists. Now, they have been essentially suppressed and pushed back against, you know, they're much smaller, but they're still despicable. These people are monsters. These people are awful, just awful. And I know that this can be upsetting to some people to have to talk about this, but it is part of our history. I'm going to discuss it. I'm never going to put any sort of graphic imagery in these videos. I would not do that to you, and I wouldn't do that to anyone. But there are going to be pictures of Klan members in this presentation, in this video. It is going to touch on the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan. I just want to give everybody a warning that this content is coming up, because I know, like I said, it can be very hurtful, very distressing to some people. So I wanted to let you know that this was coming up. Now, if you are one of my students and you've already downloaded this PowerPoint, you may have flipped ahead and see that was coming. So you may already be aware of it, but if not, and I just want to make sure that the viewer was aware that this imagery is coming up. Now, I think it goes without saying, I do not in any way support or condone the actions of that group in history or the modern day. But it is a part of our history. I am not here to glorify it. I am here to inform you of it. The more that we understand about our history, the better decisions we can make about our future and going forward. So, while I would love to only teach on the happy, upbeat parts of history, a lot of it is nasty and despicable. And in order to give a full view of history, we have to look at all of it, including the parts that we don't want to. And that is going to be later on in this video. So, just viewer, be aware of that. It is going to be later in this video, and I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that before we get started. So, let's go ahead and get into it. The role of public institutions. Freed people immediately realized the intrinsic value of learning to read and perform basic arithmetic. Only in this way could they vote wisely and protect themselves from being cheated. So the Freedmen's Bureau schools filled quickly. By 1866, there were as many as 150,000 African American students, adults and children, acquiring basic literacy. 3 years later, that number had doubled. Tuition amounted to 10% of a laborer's wage, but attendance at freedmen's schools represented a firm commitment to education. So these schools, the cost to attend these schools was 10% of what your salary was, what your wage was. So it was on a kind of a scale of what the person could afford. And getting this education was vital because, once again, people would cheat them. You know, they would say, oh yes, sign this paper, and You know, you might think you're signing to sell something for $10, and you've signed a paper that says that you agree to only get it to sell it for $2. You know, that's a small example. But, you know, people would cheat African Americans because they knew that most likely they couldn't read. So have them sign some paper, make them sign a legally binding document, even though you know they can't read it, and it was just terrible practice. In addition to establishing its own schools, the Freedmen's Bureau aided African American colleges. It also encouraged the many northern churches and charitable organizations that sent teachers, books, and supplies to support independent schools. Mostly these schools taught the basics of reading, writing, and math, but they also taught life skills such as health and nutrition, or how to look for a job. The African American church was an important component of Reconstruction education. Under slavery, slave owners sometimes allowed their slaves to hold their own religious services. Now, with freedom, African American churches were established throughout the South and often served as school sites, community centers, employment agencies, and political rallying points. By providing an arena for organizing, public speaking, and group planning, churches helped develop African American leaders. A considerable number of African American politicians began their careers as ministers. So we're seeing here that the churches and the schools are going to be vital for the education and integration of African Americans into this new society. Land distribution in the South. Many of the South's problems resulted from the uneven distribution of land. As an agricultural region, the South's wealth was defined by land ownership. Yet in 1860, the wealthiest 5% of white Southerners owned almost half the region's land. Relatively few people held the rest of the land. In fact, more than 90% of Southern land was owned by only 50% of the people. This meant that even before the war, the South had a large number of white citizens with little or no land. After the war, millions of landless Southern white people were competing with millions of landless African American people for work as farm laborers on the land of others. So we're seeing a problem here. You know, 90% of Southern land was only owned by 50% of the people, meaning that there were people that owned these huge tracts of land, and then there were many, many people who owned little to no land. And this is going to become a major issue. African American farmers who sold their crops often found the value lower than anticipated. Once again, you know, whenever African American farmers would come to sell their crops, people would cheat them on the price. And it was just a common practice. The plan developed by General Sherman and the radical Republicans to give or sell land to freed people did not provide a solution. Congress had no interest in Thaddeus Stevens' radical suggestion that large plantations be confiscated from once wealthy planters and redistributed to freemen. A few African American men, however, were able to gather together the means to buy land. By 1880, about 7% of the South's land was owned by African Americans. So while this was progress, it was quite little. And even though this little bit of progress angered some people. Sharecropping and share tenancy. Even large landowners had no money to purchase supplies or pay workers. As a result, many Southerners adopted one of three arrangements: sharecropping, share tenancy, or tenant farming. The first two of these systems could be carried out without cash. Under the sharecropping system, which embraced most of the South's African American and white poor, a landowner dictated the crop and provided the sharecropper with a place to live, as well as seeds and tools, in return for a share of the harvested crop. The landowner often bought these supplies on credit at very high interest from a supplier. The landlord passed on these costs to the sharecropper. Hence, sharecroppers were perpetually in debt to the landowner, and the landowner was always in debt to the supplier. This sharecropping system is kind of tied back into the the system back in the Middle Age known as feudalism, where a king would own the land and then he would allow peasants to live on his land if they worked his farms, and then they had to give him a percentage of all of their crops. And that's essentially what sharecropping was, and this was done in the South. Now, this was a situation that, while it gave the workers a place to live, it was essentially a different kind of slavery. It was kind of like a slavery that you agreed to, and you were perpetually in debt because the person that you were paying your debt to was always in debt to the supplier. So it was just kind of just a chain of people indebted to each other. One problem was that most landlords, remembering the huge profits from pre-war cotton, chose to invest in this crop again. Dishonest landowners could lie about the cost of supplies, devaluing the sharecropper's harvest that now amounted to less than the season's expenses. Also, the price a farmer could get for cotton and other cash crops fluctuated, tending downward in the late 1800s. Thus, the sharecropper could never move because he always owed the owner the labor for next year's crop. So once you agreed to this, you were constantly in debt to the landowner. You owed them your labor for next year's crop. So it was just a constant chain of always being in debt. Share tenancy was much like sharecropping, except that the farm worker chose what crop he would plant and bought his own supplies. Then he gave a share of the crop to the landowner. In this system, the farm worker had a bit more control over the cost of supplies. Therefore, he might be able to grow a variety of crops or use some of the land to grow food for his family. With these choices, it became more possible to save money. So share tenancy is going to be more favorable to the worker, but sharecropping ended up happening a lot more. And then there was tenant farming. The most independent arrangement for both farmer and landowner was a system known as tenant farming. In this case, the tenant paid cash rent to a landowner and then was free to choose and manage his own crop, and free to choose where he would live. This system was only viable for a farmer who had some cash to get started, good money management skills, and good luck. So, tenant farming is going to be the most beneficial to the worker. However, there is a lot more risk for the worker, and it could be, while this was best for them, it could also completely fail for them. Changes in the South sparked violence. The struggle to make a living in a region devastated by war led to fierce economic competition. Economic uncertainty in turn fueled the fire of white Southerners' outrage. Already resentful of the Republican takeover of local politics and of occupation by federal troops, white Southerners from all economic classes were united in their insistence that African Americans not have full citizenship. Now, this is a warning about the sensitive topic that is coming up, that I warned you about at the beginning of the video. Members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists terrorized freed African Americans and their supporters during Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan. The more progress African Americans made, the more hostile white Southerners became as they tried to keep freedmen in a subservient role. During Reconstruction, dozens of loosely organized groups of white Southerners emerged to terrorize African Americans. The best known of these was the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. Formed in Tennessee in 1866, Klan members roamed the countryside, especially at night, burning homes, schools, and churches, and beating, maiming, or killing African Americans and their white allies. Dressed in white robes and hoods, mounted on horses with hooves thundering through the woods, these gangs aimed to scare freed people away from voting. And this is a terrible, terrible, dark stain on our history. The Klan took special aim at the symbols of African American freedom. African American teachers in schools, churches and ministers, politicians, and anyone, white or African American, who encouraged African American people to vote. Unfortunately, often in their tactics succeeded. In many rural counties, African American voters were too intimidated to go to the polls. So this terrorism worked. They used it to scare people away from voting, to scare African American people away from running for office. And you know, if you think that if you go and vote that somebody's going to come and burn your house down, then you're probably not going to vote. The federal response. Racial violence grew even more widespread in the North as well as in the South, after the 15th Amendment guaranteed all American men the right to vote. In Arkansas, Republican legislators were murdered. In New Orleans, riots broke out. One freed woman from South Carolina reported that the Klan killed her husband, a sharecropper on the land of one Mr. Jones. The widow explained that Klan members were incensed because Mr. Jones had poor white folks on the land and he evicted them and put all these blacks on the premises. End quote. So even white people were the targets of the Klan if they were kind and receptive and supportive of the African American cause. The U.S. Congress took action, passing enforcement acts, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, in 1870 and 1871. The acts made it a federal offense to interfere with a citizen's right to vote. Congress also held hearings inviting African American politicians and other observers to describe the situation in the South. George Ruby of Texas told how he had been dragged into the woods and beaten because he had opened a school in Louisiana. Emmanuel Fortune, one of Florida's political organizers, reported that his life was in danger at all times because he was a leading man in politics. So these terrorists targeted leaders. They targeted people that were known, people that were organizers in the community. Because if you can beat up the organizer and then they don't organize people, that's going to really cut back on the number of people that get involved. Racial violence at the polls was not limited to the South. In the 1870 election in Philadelphia, a company of Marines were sent in to protect African American voters. When no such protection was supplied for the 1871 elections, an African American teacher, Octavius Catto, was killed in anti-African American political riots. At a protest meeting that followed, one African American Philadelphian spoke out. The Ku Klux of the South are not by any means the lower classes of society. The same may be said of the Ku Klux of the North. Let no man think that we ask for people's pity or commiseration. What we do ask is fairness and equal opportunities in the battle of life. That was by Isaiah Ware's 1871. So they weren't asking for special accommodations or anything. They just wanted to be treated equally as their white counterparts. Congress used the Ku Klux Klan Acts to indict hundreds of Klansmen throughout the South. After 1872, on account of the federal government's readiness to use legal action, there was a decline in violence against Republicans and African Americans. The hatred may have been contained, but it was far from extinguished. Smoldering beneath the surface, it would flare up in the coming decades. Okay everyone, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon.